So welcome, everybody. It's October 20th, 2025. We have Jack Zetklulic, who is the go-to person for many things, but including the history of American diplomacy, which is actually a camouflage, I would say, for a history of the United States. Because in Jack's discussion, we'll see a lot that will explain to us a lot when we say American diplomacy. In fact, this tells us a lot about the history of the country. Jack is his image at the moment is frozen on the screen. If he can hear me, he needs to know
I
he's frozen.
I can hear you, but if I'm
Okay.
frozen, I don't know it.
Okay, now you're back. Now, oh, announcements. On this Thursday, we will have David Kramer. Let me just check. David Kramer, who now is the director of the George Bush Jr. Library in Texas. Previously, David Kramer was very active in almost every prominent human rights group that we have, Human Rights Watch and some other nonprofits. He was also the is it an undersecretary or a deputy secretary, Jack? He was assistant secretary for the bureau we call DRL, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. This bureau has been largely dismantled by the current administration. I think the bureau still exists, but many of its functions have been removed. This is very disturbing to many of us, and I'm sure to David Kramer also. Um, I also wanted to mention a thought I had yesterday, everybody. It's way too early to make decisions on this, but if there are participants who want to continue into January and February, I'm assuming that would not be everybody, but if you would like to, we could do things together, like plan a public diplomacy strategy. Um, we could we could do some more specific types of exercises that would develop the skills that you might need. Um, Public diplomacy strategy, uh, there would be other more specific things. I do want you to start thinking, if you see in your syllabus, if you are a candidate certificate, I will ask you to do a final paper. I don't want to take time today to talk about that, but it's something to think about. A final paper is not a lengthy scholarly thing. It's a 4 to 5 page reflection on any of the options that I've given you in the syllabus, or really any other thing that you would care to do. Now, let's move to Jack Zetklulic. Jack has been heroically battling an ocean storm off the coast of Connecticut. Thank you for doing that successfully. Connecticut came out surviving, Jack. I'm sure that's your doing. And now we have him back in the area, and we're going to talk today about the history of American diplomacy. Now, interestingly, here we go, share. Okay. Jack has a fantastic PowerPoint on this, which I'm going to put up right now. And let me get it to full screen. Jack Zetklulic, over to you. Jack, you are muted. Let's see.
Hi, Dan,
Yes,
and
we hear
thank
you now.
you very much, folks. I do apologize. I'm doing the class on my
Um,
phone.
Jack,
Uh,
we're really not getting good audio. Can you maybe try to sit somewhere else, perhaps?
could Can you hear me okay?
Now I can. Yes, yes. Go
Um,
ahead.
Hi, everybody. It's good. Will that help? I'm Dan.
Yes, we're getting 30%, Jack. 30%. Want to try once more?
Hmm. Okay, well, I am moving locations in my home.
Okay.
Hold on.
Now that was good. That was good a moment ago.
I am talking and I'm talking and I'm talking and I'm talking.
No, that's good. That's
And
good. Don't move. Don't move. You're okay. You're good now. Uh, yeah.
okay, let's see now. This is the miracle of modern technology.
Yeah.
How am I doing?
Very well.
Are
You're
we
doing very
happy?
well. Yep. Yep. We got you.
Okay. So thanks to Dan uh, for advancing the slides as we go through. Um, I should tell you in advance that about oh my gosh, it's 20 more than 20 years ago when I was working at the Foreign Service Institute. A friend of mine who was our Undersecretary for Political Affairs recognized the fact that many of our young diplomats in the U.S. did not really know much about their own diplomatic history, and we tried to create a 1 week long course, a crash course in U.S. diplomacy at the Foreign Service Institute. And we didn't have the money and we didn't have the time, mainly the time for training, because I can tell you for a fact that the U.S. Foreign Service is sort of anti-training. They tend to sort of hire smart people and throw them into the midst of things without any training. And this initiative eventually morphed into a 1 hour, 60-minute lecture by me to incoming diplomats.
Oh my God.
So
Oh my gosh.
I used
Oh
to,
my God.
if you blink, you'll miss the score. But it was eventually it was transcribed and put on the website of the organization that both Dan and I worked with, ADST. It's still there, I think, but it's now a little bit out of date. So I'll give you an up-to-date version of it. Um, Dan, could you advance the slide, please?
Yes. There we go. Yep.
So you can listen to the next 5 minutes and then you can go have breakfast, lunch, or dinner, because I'm going to tell you all you need to know in with just 3 words, and the rest is all details. When it comes to U.S. diplomatic history, it's very different than many other countries. I would say even most other countries. The reason is it really has only had three basic uh, themes and or three basic periods of work. The first was rather simple. It comes back every now and then during wartime. It's basic survival. Diplomats have to defend their countries in order to, especially when it's a brand new country. And when the U.S. began, it was small and it was weak, and it had to rely on some very smart men who were overseas to work as diplomats. Um, then, very quickly, the U.S. began to expand, first across the Appalachian Mountains, and then further down, down into Florida, out west, all the way, and eventually deep into the Pacific Ocean. The 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 view at the very earliest beginnings of the United States was that without expansion, the U.S. could not survive. That it could not survive just as a small collection of states clinging to the Atlantic seaboard. It had to expand. Very also from the very beginnings, the United States particular and exceptional view of itself, and this is really important because it is fundamental to our work, but also to how it has affected the world around us, almost all of it, in fact, and that is transformation. That is changing the world to a different model than the one that had existed for many years before. At the time that the United States was created, there were only two republics. One was Switzerland, and the other was the United States. And we were poor, we were small, we were weak. But at that time, the expectation was that the United States would serve as a model for other countries to develop into, other countries around the world. The phrase that was quoted by in a famous sermon by a Protestant pastor in New England was that the United States would be a city on a hill. That is to say, a shining example of what the world should be like, and that this example would be followed by other countries. This changed and evolved over time. The hope that we would be a good example, despite all of our faults, that we weren't perfect, but we would be a better example to follow than others. This changed over time. It evolved over time as we became more powerful, so that in the end we were not only just serving as an example, we were actively involved in making the world different, in making it look more like us, so that the countries that we were involved in, we wanted to have systems of government that were more based on our model. Now, you can say that this is this is a rather paternalistic view, or that this is a rather too overly ideological view, but it is also a practical view. And if you just step back for a second and look at history, you recognize that democratic countries, genuinely democratic countries, don't go to war with each other. If you look back in history, I think it would be hard to find any example of two genuinely democratic countries going to war with each other. So this was not just an ideological approach. This was a practical approach. At this point, though, I have to step back and say there is now an asterisk on that word transformation, and there is an asterisk on that policy. So almost 250 years, we survived, we expanded, and we transformed. That has changed in the current administration, and one can hope that the current administration is more of an aberration, that we will go back to being a better model in the future and have a different approach. We'll talk in a bit more detail about this when we get to the end of the lecture. Could you advance it, Dan? Oh, no, you're at the end. Go. Oh, sorry. No, that's fine. That's perfect. As we talk about U.S. policy, there are certain themes that you will see all the time. One of the most classic and reliable themes that you always talk about in international relations classes and foreign policy classes is realism versus idealism. You don't have to be one or the other. You can blend the two. But generally speaking, realists tend to be less idealistic. And you see examples there, classic examples of at the top of Kissinger and Dick Cheney and George W. Bush. More Cheney than Bush, because I don't think Mr. Bush was very attentive to the matters of theory. But those were classic realists. They engaged in realpolitik. They were concerned about issues such as force and power. Then you have other examples of Woodrow Wilson, Jimmy Carter, who focus more on idealism, who do things like, under Carter, start the bureau that in the State Department that Dan referred to, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. Or Woodrow Wilson, who well before that had his 14 points that he used during negotiations at the Treaty of Versailles that ended the First World War, to use as an ideological foundation, an ideological backdrop for the negotiations there. Next slide, Dan. So here, we're not even in the United States. The United States has not begun yet. And, look at those that crazy collection of little tiny colonies, all very separate, all very different, along the east coast of the United States. Now, by late in the colonial period, the different colonial leaders and legislatures, because they did have local legislatures, they would send agents and business representatives to London, the imperial capital, and also some other capitals, such as Paris and others, on behalf of the individual colonies. Now, Pennsylvania sent our favorite and our most famous diplomat, Ben Franklin, to London, and he gained valuable experience in the art of diplomacy. And his treatment there, the way he was treated by the British, cemented his view that he had become something new, that he was not an Englishman, he was an American. He also was hired by other colonies that recognized the utility of having a representative in London to communicate to the royal court and parliament through. But unfortunately, most of his, while he was popular as an individual because of his scientific achievements and his personality, the king did not agree with this approach, and colonial representatives were redirected back to talk with their respective governors in the colonies. Next slide. So we were kind of blessed early on by some very smart people who had very little experience in this area, but who did a pretty good job early on in what I would call revolutionary diplomacy. That is the diplomacy that took place immediately after the Declaration of Independence. The New Continental Congress created I love the name of this. It established the, quote, Committee of Secret Correspondence, unquote. Isn't that a great name? I mean, it's so cool. Anyway, it would exercise authority over and coordinate policy over foreign affairs. Now, despite the really cool name, unfortunately, the committee functioned about as well as committees usually do during a crisis, which is to say, not very well at all. In the meantime, though, we did send our diplomatic stars off. Franklin served in Paris from 1776 to 1778, and the French embraced him as the personification of the New World Enlightenment. The French king, however, kept him at arm's length. And our goal at the time was, again, survival, just surviving from one day to the next, from 1 month to the next. It was Franklin's goal to try to get French support in the terms of weapons and also in terms of intelligence information and money. At the beginning, he was not terrifically successful, but then as he did get some covert assistance from them, and after the Battle of Saratoga, things changed, and the French eventually did recognize the United States and offer its navy to serve the American cause rather late in the game. For those of you who are in countries that are not huge and strong, I can tell you that diplomats, I have met many diplomats from relatively small, medium-sized countries who punch above their weight in boxing terms. They really are good at what they do, and sometimes they do things that are they do what they can do to survive. A classic example of what Franklin did was that when he was trying to push the French towards recognition and supporting the American cause, he showed a good example of how to win with a losing hand. He basically hoodwinked the French with his diplomacy. He knew that his legation, was a den of spies. Even his butler was a British spy. So he invited a British representative to what he called a secret meeting, even though everybody knew about it. This was Paris, after all. And the fact of the meeting was quickly found out, although the actual words exchanged were not. And these words were inconsequential. It was an uneventful and inconsequential meeting. But the French impression of that Franklin might be cutting a deal with the British to end the war, which would not be to their advantage, this encouraged the French to increase military and other support to the U.S. and to recognize the United States earlier than they otherwise would have.
We talked earlier about the use of deceit and deception as an instrument of strategy. I think everybody listening has linked that concept with what Jack has just told us, that a strategy will almost always have an element of deceit in it. Just adding that.
I can tell you as an aside, the American humorist Ambrose Bierce defined diplomacy as when an honest man is sent abroad to lie for his country. Uh, I think I've only actually lied once in a negotiation at the time, but at the time I think everyone knew I was lying, so it worked. Anyway, we'll move on. We also had Thomas Jefferson. You were there. He was a great line. He was introduced to the Comte de Vergennes, the French foreign minister, who asked him when upon his arrival, the French minister asked him, "It is you who will replace Dr. Franklin?" And Jefferson, who was always the gracious Virginia gentleman, replied, "No one can replace him, sir. I am merely his successor." I love that line. Uh, then we have John Adams, who became our second president. Jefferson became our third. It was a less heralded work that he did, but it was actually very, very impactful. He recognized that in Paris he was not getting very far with his efforts to get money. So without any instructions from his capital, without any instructions from the Continental Congress, he got in a horse and traveled to Holland, to the Netherlands, where he organized, he extracted from the Dutch a series of loans that kept the revolution financially alive. Now, despite the fact that he did not have any guidance or instructions from the Continental Congress, when he went back to when he said, "I got this money," to the Continental Congress, they said, "Well, I guess we'll just have to take it," and the loans were eventually paid off. Next slide, Dan. These are the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris, which was the treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War. The Americans are there on the left, and the British are not there on the right. They are the empty space that you'll see because they refused they refused to sit for their portraits. Oh well. In 1789, the new Constitution divided authority over foreign affairs between the executive and the legislature. Enabling legislation called for an act to provide for the safekeeping of the acts, records, and seal of the United States and for other purposes. And with this, the Department of State was created. Thomas Jefferson was our first Secretary of State. His entire staff numbered 8, including the janitor who cleaned the. But what were the so-called other purposes referred to in the Constitution? There's no mention of foreign affairs, none at all. The initial responsibilities of the Department of State were both foreign and domestic. It ran the census every 10 years. It maintained the Great Seal of the Republic. It printed money. Later on, all of these domestic responsibilities were sent out to other agencies and departments, and then it was left with just foreign affairs. Can we go to the next screen, Dan? Thank you.
Yep.
So one of the first challenges to the United States, very early on, just a few years after we declared independence, we were poor and we had no navy. Whereas before, our merchant ships would be protected in the Atlantic and in the Mediterranean from pirates and such by the British Navy, we had no navy. So the Barbary pirates would attack us and steal our stuff. And during this period of weakness, well, we could not afford our principles. It's simple as that. We could not afford to do the right thing. We had to pay up. People always say, "Oh, the United States never, we never pay ransoms." Well, hey, I'm sorry, we did. And this was the first. Well, this inspired us to create the United States Navy, which has grown and grown ever since. But it was interesting in that this was the United States' first interaction with the Muslim world. And it's unfortunate because here we had merchant ships being attacked and sailors were being sold into slavery and ransomed for gold. And the question was, what are we going to do about this? Now, interestingly enough, in 1786, two future US presidents, Jefferson and Adams, were in London as diplomats, and they met in London with the ambassador of Tripoli, the state of Tripoli, and his name was Sidi Haji Abdul Rahman Ajar. And Mr. Jefferson asked the ambassador to explain why his people were so hostile to the United States. He said, we're a peaceful country, and we've never done you any harm, and we've only sought mutually profitable commerce. Why are you doing this to us? And the ambassador gave a remarkably frank and direct answer, which Adams, who was always a very good note taker, he was a good lawyer, he took down verbatim, and he said, quote, the ambassador's animosity was, quote, founded on the laws of the prophet, that it was written in their Quran that all nations who should not have acknowledged their authority were sinners, and that it was in their right and duty to make war upon them wherever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take as prisoners, and that every Muslim, every Muslim who should be slain in battle was sure to go directly to paradise. That was nearly 250 years ago. And, I told you up front, some of these themes echo through the centuries. And unfortunately, this one has echoed quite clearly. Next slide. Dan, there we go.
Yes, that is the next slide. Do you see it, Jack? It's two
Got
ships.
it. Thank you.
Yep.
And that's an example of the United States, shelling one of the harbors in North Africa. Next slide, Dan. So one of the next big challenges to the United States, foreign policy challenge faced by the early republic, was the slave revolt in Haiti. This rebellion was sort of the dramatic and logical extension of first the American Revolution and second the French Revolution, because these revolutions just kept getting more violent. How did we respond? How did we respond to a young country, a former colony, trying to get its independence? You would think that we would be supportive of Haiti. Well, at the time, Napoleon had bold plans for America. He wanted to use New Orleans as a base to extend his empire into the Louisiana Territory and beyond. However, the Haiti rebellion emptied his coffers, and he was desperate for cash. James Monroe, who our Secretary of State, was sent to Paris with $10 million for the purchase of the city of New Orleans and a small area of the Gulf Coast extending over to Florida. And he did a brave and wonderful thing. He chose to exceed his authority. Adams, before him in Paris, he was offered for $15 million Louisiana Territory, which more than doubled the size of the United States. Mm-hmm. And by the way, do you ever recognize Haiti? No, not until the Lincoln administration during the Civil War, when the views of Southern slaveholders carried very little weight in Washington. Next slide, please, Dan. So here you see the territorial expansion of the United States. Again, expansion whenever we can, moving out westward, and the massive size of the Louisiana Purchase. Next slide, Dan. Moving on, we get to the War of 1812. Many people don't really think much about this. It was a relatively short war. It's kind of, many people skip over it in history classes, but effectively it was the Second War of Independence. Like most people do understand the reasons, though. There was the impressment of American sailors, and also the lure of possible territorial expansion into Canada. There were problems with fisheries and who owned the fish in the ocean. But there was a very decidedly mixed reaction in general to the outbreak of war between the U.S. and the United Kingdom, and there were, especially regionally. Secretary of State Monroe sent a letter to our chargé d'affaires in London at the embassy there, and he described the administration's attitude as, quote, "At the moment of the declaration of war, the president regretted the necessity which produced it, looked to its termination, and provided for it." Now, one of the great advantages of a very quick war, mainly fought at sea, was the quick and amicable peace we negotiated with the United Kingdom. It was the Treaty of Ghent, which laid the foundation for what has become known as the quote unquote special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom. Now, after a century of very active diplomacy and the gradual convergence of our respective national interests, Britain became the United States' closest ally ever and probably always will be. I can tell you for a fact that the closeness of this relationship between the capitals and overseas and negotiations is in everything from defense to intelligence. From there, next slide, Dan.
Yep. Do you see it? It's
Not
there.
yet, but it's a little slow.
Yeah, there. Yeah, it's slow, but it's there. It's there.
Which one are you looking at? Oh yeah, there we go. I love these pictures. This is this is Washington, the city of Washington D.C. being burned during the British during the War of 1812, and that's just a classic political cartoon from the era of the American president giving the British king a bloody nose. Okay, fine. Next slide, Dan.
Yep.
So yeah, that is the entire cabinet of the United States. We'll go on. I'm looking at my watch and time. Next slide, Dan.
John Guest. There we go.
Yeah.
Uh,
So manifest death, something that is manifest must happen. It's just something that is inevitable, and this is a classic picture of what, and the details are fascinating, a classic picture of what is considered to be the future of the United States during this period of time, the early to mid 1800s. That is, Lady Liberty, our symbol of our nation. She's very beautiful. She's nice. She's floating happily westward, and with her are what? You have settlers in their road. You have the telegraph. You have hunters and explorers moving westward. Oh, and look down to the bottom left. Who are they? Oh, those are just Native Americans, and they're kind of getting out of the way. That was the view of that period of time. Next slide, Dan.
Yep. I guess these are coming up slowly at your end. They are.
That's okay.
Yep.
So they have finally, at least the, not including Alaska and Hawaii and various other colonies that we accrued later, the expansion of the U.S. all the way out to the Pacific. Next slide, Dan. We had a nasty little war with Mexico. The fellow to the left was a one-term president who had a laser focus, his core priority, and he said it when he was running for president, and it was the first thing he started doing when he became president, was to expand American territory into Mexico as far as possible and also out to the Pacific. He first engaged in some rather perfunctory and lackluster negotiations, and then he got down to the business of conquest. A border incident was arranged, and he went in heavy, grabbed what was then 1/3 of Mexico's recognized territory. The Polk administration also established through negotiation our borders with in the Northwest with Canada. And one of the interesting things about you get into the question of diplomacy here. Does diplomacy follow military action? Does it precede it? Does it go along hand in hand? In the case of the war in Mexico, there was no plan to end the war. Does this sound familiar? Can you think about Iraq or Afghanistan? There was no end game planned. They just wanted to take as much as they could. In the end, various Americans, journalists, vagabonds, various people were engaged in negotiations with the Mexicans to end the war, and it finally took Washington to send an actual diplomat, a fellow named Nicholas Trist, who was called the first clerk of the Department of State, to negotiate the end of the war. He had authority from the president, but the commanders on the ground did not like him because they did not trust him because he was a member of a different political party. There were Democrats and Whigs at that time. However, he did show up with with a case of the favorite alcoholic beverage of the local commander, and after several evenings of entertainment, the commander stepped aside and let Nicholas Trist do the negotiations, which were eventually successful. Next slide, Dan.
Oop. Yep.
So during this period of time, those two pictures are great. We talked about cross-cultural communications the last time. The two pictures at the top are of the same human being. That is, isn't that a slightly different view? The first view is an American view of an American naval commander. The second picture is a Japanese view of that same man. At this time, in the like 1850, early 1850s to mid 1850s, diplomatic initiatives and military action went hand in hand as America engaged in commercial and territorial expansion. In the Pacific Rim, Commodore Perry, this gentleman you see here, engaged in what was called gunboat diplomacy, in which he opened Japan with two missions in 1854 and 1855. And when we think about why, what was the goal of the United States? At this period of time, when we get to the far side of the Pacific Ocean, we were not necessarily talking about territorial expansion, but it was a different kind of expansion. It was commercial expansion, and I'll give you two reasons why. A U.S. government survey reports that taken at this time said that Japan said of our relations with Japan, quote, "We shall carry to Europe their teas and their silks. The results are so vast as to dazzle even sober calculation." So we were engaged in we wanted to get engaged in trade. Now in China, an even bigger and bigger potential prize, we wanted to build railroads and sell our manufactured goods, especially textiles. China was seen as such a huge market that one of our consuls in Guangzhou, China, which was then called Canton by us, sent in a fascinating dispatch. He said, quote, "If we can convince the Chinaman to wear his shirt but 1 inch longer, we can keep the mills, the textile mills of Lowell, Massachusetts, spinning feverishly into eternity." So here you have a situation where history was a little bit different. Here you have the United States trying to sell textiles to China, and now it's the exact opposite. Next slide, Dan. That was the Canton. That was my first post in the Foreign Service, Guangzhou, China. That's a little island called Shamian Island, and those are the little legations of the Dutch, the British, the Americans, etc. And they were stuck there. They couldn't leave the island in most cases, and they engaged in both commercial work and diplomatic work. Next slide, Dan. So here we get back to the question of survival. We're not just expanding or transforming, we're surviving. During the Civil War, our main goal in diplomacy was to strangle the Confederacy as best we can. And we just had to survive. Our Secretary of State, his name was Seward, he put it in a nutshell. Even before the war, he said, quote, "The most important duty of the diplomatic representatives of the United States in Europe will be to counteract by all proper means the efforts of the agents of the projected Confederacy," unquote. He said proper, but we also did improper. The fellow you see sitting there in the chair is John Francis Adams, who is our representative in London. He did everything he could. He bought journalists to write editorials in our favor. He had spies. He had saboteurs that he hired to do things like blow up or disable ships that were being built for the Confederacy in London, in the UK. And of his work there, General later President Grant said, "None of our generals did as better or more trying service than he has in his outpost of London." Next, next post, Dan. So this is the period of American empire. These three gentlemen you see were sort of the intellectual and political oomph behind the growth of the U.S. After the Civil War, the absence of any external challenges, we had the hemisphere to ourselves, basically. We had a growing population and unleashed economic might. It led to vast territorial and commercial expansion. Thanks to the work ethic of the U.S. and capitalist endeavor that assumed almost religious authority, ambition was sanctified, business was virtuous, and success was blessed by God. The people you see here, Alfred Mahan was a naval strategist whose theory was that the United States did not necessarily need territory overseas, but coaling stations where our ships could put in. And there's a great quote from him. He said, quote, it tells you the views of that period of time. "I am frankly an imperialist in the sense that I believe that no nation, certainly no great nation, should maintain the policy of isolation which fitted our earlier history. Above all, should not, on that outlived premise, refuse to intervene in events obviously thrust upon its conscience by Providence, by God." Henry Cabot Lodge, the fellow in the middle, was a rather bigoted but also very smart senator who pushed these policies through Congress. John Hay, to the right, our Secretary of State, who had previously worked as a secretary for Abraham Lincoln years before, was the one who led these efforts at the Department of State. Next slide. So remember the Maine. That was the Maine was an American ship that was sunk in Havana Harbor. It was the victim of Spanish perfidy, as was then stated, and it was used as the excuse for us to begin a war between the United States and Spain. Interestingly enough, years later, decades later, a technical survey was commissioned by the United States Navy that actually went down and looked at the Maine, the remains of the Maine in Havana Harbor, and they found out that there was no sabotage, that it was an internal explosion that blew up the ship. But that didn't matter at the time, did it? Because as the result of our war there, we took Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and also at that time, we gained control through negotiation and in some cases force, Guam, Samoa, and we extended our control over Panama. Next slide, please. So that's the new expanded territories controlled by the U.S. down into the Caribbean and out all the way across the Pacific. Next slide. So there's one of our great presidents, Teddy Roosevelt. He was perhaps foremost among all of our empire builders. He was hyper energetic. He was a former Secretary of the Navy, he had fought in the Spanish-American War, and he knew how to get things done. He would just do them. A classic example is when he wanted to send our capital ships, our battleships, around the world to prove American might, just to stop in ports all around the world, to circumnavigate the planet. It was called the Great White Fleet. He wanted to send them. You can hit the next slide there, Dan. He wanted to send them on a round the world tour to showcase our strength. And Congress responded by that it simply didn't have enough money in the budget for such an extravagance. It had maybe half of the money that was needed. So Roosevelt said, okay, and he sent the fleet halfway around the world. And then he went back to Congress and he said, do you want them back? So with his combination of audacity, energy, arrogance, generosity, and paternalism, he personified this era. Also during this period of time, we engaged in the slow motion conquests of Hawaii, a coup d'etat which was inspired by American businessmen living there. And Hawaii was crucial. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee wrote a report that said, quote, the issue in Hawaii is not between native monarchy and our republic. The issue is whether, in that inevitable struggle, Asia or America shall have the vantage ground of this naval key and the commercial crossroads of the Pacific. President McKinley, who was a bit more direct in his language, he said, quote, we need Hawaii as much and a good deal more than we did California. It is our manifest destiny. Next slide, Dan. So there's our friend Woodrow Wilson. I'll quickly go through World War I. We were kind of sucked into it. The isolationism was strong in the U.S. A lot of people thought we could hide. We've got with the Pacific on one side, the Atlantic on the other. Their hostilities early on seemed to be inevitable in Europe, but America's involvement in the war was not. At first, the question was, can America avoid entanglement in Europe's battles? But very quickly, the question became, how long can we keep out of the fight before being sucked in? Next slide. And there we have, after the U.S. Jumped into World War I in its last year, we were a driving force in the negotiations at Versailles. There's a political cartoon that you should take a look at down in the bottom right corner. Though there's Clemenceau and Wilson and etc. Walking out of the negotiation, and they're saying, do I hear someone crying? Well, I wonder what that is. And they just keep on walking. And that's a little tiny, like a toddler, a little boy. And he represents the next generation. Now, this is the cartoonist drew, I think, a very good representation of what would happen, because it was recognized that Versailles ended a war, but did not create what was considered at the time to be the structures for a lasting peace. And so that little boy would grow up to be a soldier in the next World War, just 2 decades later. You can skip that one, Dan. And that one.
Okay.
That's one I use for my foreign service students, and you can skip that one. So in the 1920s, this is a fascinating period of time, because here we have the United States. It had become a world power, but it effectively did not engage in diplomacy. American presidents in the interwar years did not exactly stride on the world stage. Quite the contrary. In fact, I'll give you some examples. Mr. Harding on the left, when he was interviewed by a British journalist, he waved off all foreign policy questions, saying, I don't know anything about this Europe stuff. That is a direct quote. Mr. Coolidge in the middle was even more reticent. In his autobiography, which was as thick as he was thin, there is not a single mention of foreign policy. Can you imagine that? And then Mr. Hoover, who had seen the results of war when leading reconstruction efforts in Europe, had a different view. He said, quote, healthy trade relations are the route to peace. It's a great quote. The Germans call it Wandel durch Handel, which means change through commerce, that you can change your relation. And they've tried this with Russia since 1991. But anyway, the idea is that you can change a country by engaging with it in commerce. Next slide. So what happens when countries go back into their borders, engage in isolationism, draw down their militaries? Well, something has to fill the vacuum. So here we have the beginnings of World War II, the expansion of Germany and the expansion of Japan. The Japanese called their intended area of influence the East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and the Germans were looking for their Lebensraum. In either case, it led to expansion of their territory, both politically and diplomatically and violently. During this period of time, the United States was not. Oh, next slide. During this period of time, the United States was politically neutral, but not ideologically so, and not commercially so. President Roosevelt proclaimed, quote, "This nation will remain a neutral nation, but I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well." So our basic policy was to hope that we could avoid war while we simultaneously provided as much aid as possible to those who were at war with the Axis, the Japanese, and that is the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians. Our trade with quote unquote Canada, then a British Dominion, rose dramatically. All of a sudden, Canada seemed to need a lot more steel and manufactured goods than it ever did before. And the US Navy eventually even escorted American and Allied transports all the way to the mid-Atlantic, where they were then picked up by the British Navy. The so-called Lend-Lease deal traded British bases for old American destroyers. Now, this faced some resistance in Congress, but Roosevelt's floor managers pushed this through after artfully numbering the act H.R. 1776, which made it sound very patriotic. And one very little known fact, it's really fascinating. During this period of time, before the United States was in the war, we sent 4,000 U.S. Marines to Iceland in the North Atlantic for what was called, quote, hemispheric defense, unquote. And there was no legal basis for this whatsoever, but it was considered to be the right thing to do, and we didn't make a big deal about it. Next slide. Now, the interesting thing, who conducted American diplomacy before and during the war? The answer is most definitely not the State Department. Cordell Hull, our longest-serving Secretary of State, was remembered best for two things: setting policy on trade tariffs and getting out of the way when the White House wanted to make policy. Instead, Roosevelt was served by trusted advisors in the White House, some of whom didn't even have any governmental role. The two main areas of focus of wartime diplomacy were first, the future borders of Europe, that is, the eventual spheres of influence of the winners, and second, the opening up of a second front. That is, Stalin called this the first thing algebra, and the second practical arithmetic. 18 major wartime conferences took place. The USSR participated only about 1/3 of these. The rest were between the US and the UK and allies. And the US was clearly in the driver's seat. Our time was becoming what Time magazine Henry Luce called the American century, and so much so that, think about this, in the decade after the war, from 1945 to 1955, the U.S. controlled one half of the planet Earth's entire industrial production. Next slide, please, Dan. So we get to the Cold War. Now, historiography, which is the study of the study of history, is a very crowded place. Who started the Cold War? Was it inevitable? This is one of those classic chicken and the egg questions, and there are lots of books written about it. I'm not going to go into all of these now. We've got Daniel Yergin wrote a book called Shattered Peace. Louis Gaddis wrote The Cold War: A New History. There are lots and lots of books out there with lots of different views. But the fellow to the left, George Kennan, a brilliant American diplomat, when posted in Moscow, he wrote what we consider to be the gold standard of contemporaneous analysis of Soviet behavior, which was called, eventually became what was called the X article. It was originally called the Long Telegram because it was what? A long telegram that he sent from Moscow. But it was later published in Foreign Affairs, the magazine, as quote, the sources of Soviet conduct, unquote. And the article was based on his view as he sat in Moscow and of his analysis of the sources of the Soviets' aggressive behavior, and judged that they simply could not be trusted. He recommended a policy of containment, which was a paradigm we followed for nearly half a century. Next slide. So that's the world. In this case, 1959, you've got neutral states, basically in white, and then you've got those aligned with the West and those aligned with the communist countries. The interesting thing is that the Cold War was largely a zero-sum game, and it resulted in what people call a neo-mercantilistic foreign policy, whereby what was good for one side was bad for the other side, and vice versa. This later led to a view and a policy enunciated by a lady named Jean Kirkpatrick. She was a Georgetown professor who then became our ambassador to the United Nations. And now her view was that while fascist dictatorships can evolve, communist dictatorships cannot. Now, this is why we got in bed with the Pinochets in Chile and the Diems in Vietnam and the Greek colonels and various other tin pot dictators on 4 continents. Now, Kirkpatrick was proven wrong eventually in 1989-91 when communist states did, in fact, evolve toward democracy. Next slide, Dan. But during that period of time, we had this zero-sum game of massive national arsenals of nuclear weapons, and then smaller wars fought with conventional weapons. Next slide, Dan. And that's a great picture. That's Kennedy and Khrushchev, battling it out during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Next slide, Dan. And during this period of time, the U.S. diplomacy was focused on building alliances to counter the communist threat. Regional associations, which included NATO, CETO, Centro, ANZUS. And during this time, we conducted numerous proxy wars. Next slide, Dan. I'm going to go past this one.
Pass.
Yeah, this is perfect. So there we have an example of Vietnam, a horrific war that was a proxy war between the East and the West. I would say that in the late 1950s, when we first became involved there by Senate advisors under President Eisenhower, and then when we escalated under President Kennedy and then President Johnson. At the beginning, most Americans couldn't find Vietnam on a map, but it was considered to be the front line of the West's fight with the East. Next slide. You can skip this one, please. So we have the end of the Cold War. Some people will tell you that the person who ended the Cold War was Ronald Reagan. I disagree. It was people like Václav Havel and Gorbachev who changed things from within in their own societies. The geopolitical changes that occurred between 1989 and 1991 were absolutely breathtaking. Nobody predicted in the months beforehand the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody predicted that glasnost and perestroika would result in the breakup of the Soviet Union. No one predicted the split of Czechoslovakia, but then at the time, no one really cared. And while everyone foresaw the self-destruction of Yugoslavia, nobody wanted anything to do with it. They didn't want to get involved. As James Baker infamously said, after helping his President Bush, shepherding them through this challenging period of instability in Europe. When it comes to Yugoslavia, quote, "We don't have a dog in this fight," unquote. I was actually about 15 feet away from him when he said that at the Berlin Ministerial of the OSCE. Next slide. So there goes the Berlin Wall. That was fun. Next slide. There's our friend, Mr. Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, the first President Bush, who he did. I think he deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the engaging in. Think about this in one presidential administration, the breakup of the Soviet Union, the reunification of Germany, the first Gulf War, which marked the first major post-World War II event in which the Soviet Union was on the sidelines. He created a coalition of the willing, of an ad hoc grouping of companies, and this was great diplomacy. It was an ad hoc grouping of countries with immediate common interests, not an institutionalized pact based on existing alliance structures. And then the Treaty of Paris, which institutionalized the Helsinki process by creating the Organization for the Security and Cooperation in Europe, which used preventive diplomacy in the future. Next slide. And yeah, this was the 1990s. This was an amazing period of time. You have the Gulf War, the creation of the OSCE. There's the Dayton peace talks. That's actually me in the far right corner in that picture behind President Tudjman of Croatia. And then we have the war in Kosovo as well, which was pretty horrific. The eras are political eras, historical eras. They're usually defined well after they have occurred. So we still don't have a name for our current period that fits better than the post-Cold War era. So in the 10 years between the fall of communism in 1991 and the terrorist attacks of 2001, so 10 years, no fundamental reevaluation of American foreign policy actually took place. The public was, as well as some practitioners, seemed to miss the clarity of the Cold War when wins and losses could be tallied with greater certainty. American leadership in first the diplomatic efforts to end the war in Bosnia, and soon thereafter the NATO air campaign to stop Milosevic's genocide in Kosovo, they were grudgingly accepted as the duty of the world's last superpower, a question of noblesse oblige. But during this period of time, no new ideological or foreign policy structure was established. But also during this period of time, I have to say, as a professional diplomat, a series of secretaries of state, Christopher Albright Powell, they kind of took the back seat to the National Security Council, the Pentagon, and the Office of the Vice President. We're going to get to the next slide, I think, or are we? Yeah, so there's 9/11. That's a photo taken from the International Space Station, I think, or maybe one of the shuttles. It was an American astronaut took this picture. That's New York. That's Manhattan, that little sliver. I live down in the bottom right corner. That's where I grew up. That is the smoke from the World Trade Center and the other buildings that were destroyed. This fundamentally changed the focus of U.S. policy. Next slide. And it created the global war on terror. There you have President Bush being told by his chief of staff, Andy Card, something bad happened, boss. And it took him a while to react, but then he got in the plane and flew around the United States, not landing for quite a while. And then we have the global war on terror. And our invasion, later our excuse to invade Iraq for no good reason. And then we have our friend Vice President Cheney looking kind of like Dr. Strangelove in his wheelchair. I think we're jumping now to yeah, okay. We can stop the slides, and you can look at my handsome face, and we can quickly go through the last three administrations. George W. Bush, he had no real interest in foreign policy. He thought that he actually thought that Taliban was a musical group until after 9/11, which changed everything. He called out the axis of evil, which was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, even though these countries did not coordinate on anything. But he activated Article 5 of the NATO treaty, the only time it's ever been activated, and invaded Afghanistan. But our goals in Afghanistan were unclear. We had no policy there, no end game planned apart from destroying the Taliban and killing bin Laden, which took a while to do. And then we invaded Iraq to destroy weapons of mass destruction, which many people in the administration knew were not there in the first place. Then we had the Obama administration. We all lived through that. Apart from his very fervent dedication to fighting climate change, I would say that Obama's foreign policy was generally rather piecemeal, very pragmatic in the short term. He did not have a broad vision. He went into it saying, quote, "Don't do stupid stuff," end quote. But given the fact that he was constrained by a country in an economic crisis at that time, from the big real estate and stock crash, and two very unpopular wars, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan, without an exit strategy for either, thanks to the previous president. He made various promises that he did meet. He did withdraw most U.S. troops in Iraq. In Afghanistan, he did keep the Taliban from regaining power, but that was mainly a result of the previous military surge. One of the foreign policy instruments was also a military instrument. Something you hear about a lot now was the creation and use of drones for the first time. In this case, the United States used them against Syria and Libya, despite the fact that he didn't use the War Powers Act. But there were a lot of unkept promises under Obama. He made his famous Cairo speech in June 2009. He called it a new beginning, which wasn't really followed up, I think, in any way by support for democracy and democratic forces in the Middle East. He kept writing red lines in the sand in Syria. If you use chemical weapons, you will take action. And Assad used chemical weapons, and we didn't really do much about it. And in the end, Obama asked, of all people, Putin to intercede with his friend Assad. And then we have, of course, February 2014, the invasion of Crimea, which was we relied on what to stop that from happening? Economic sanctions, which in the history of our planet have generally not worked. I think they worked in Rhodesia/Zimbabwe, and that's about it. But he did some good things. The JCPOA with Iran, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Paris Accords on climate. Unfortunately, we then had the first Trump term after Obama, which took a very slow, was a very slow start. It was excruciating at the beginning for them to do anything. There was effectively no transition. I think this was because Trump didn't expect to win in the first place, and he was so uncoordinated that there were no valid, no vetted and confirmed appointees for months, almost 9, 10 months after he got in. But then he made very clear his so-called America First policy, which harkens back to the neo-fascist and bigoted policies of the United States of some American political leaders in the 1930s. And his policy was effectively zero-sum and transactional. He didn't have a foreign policy as such. There was no ideological construct, except he wanted to, it was a negative policy, withdrawing from multinational organizations, alienating friends and allies, and in many cases sucking up to authoritative leaders like Kim Jong-un, who he said he loved, and Putin, who he met with. Oh, and as a diplomat, I can tell you this is the most horrible thing you can imagine. It makes my skin crawl. When he met in Helsinki, they met alone, just the two men and their interpreters, who were then sworn, the American was then sworn to secrecy, and they stole her notes out of her hand. So it's a bit of a contradiction in Trump policy, if you want to call it that. He is effectively, in the first administration, he was effectively an isolationist, but he believed in a strong military buildup. So the two don't necessarily go together. And he pulled out of pulled out of Afghanistan, pulled out of the JCPOA with Iran, pulled out of the Paris Accords on climate, and then pulled out of the North American Free Trade Accord. And in the case of Israel, he, without any quid pro quo, he declared that we would move our embassy to Jerusalem. He got nothing out of the deal. And he claimed credit for the Abraham Accords, even though the Abraham Accords had been worked on for a decade prior by mainly Arab diplomats from the Gulf states with Israel. So, real quick, Biden foreign policy. He came in with a tremendous amount of experience. I can tell you from personal experience that he was great in the meeting, knew his stuff from being in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a firm believer in institutions and coalitions and partnership, which is, I think, why he brought in the old guard. After years of erratic policy decisions by Trump, he aimed to bring a state of normalcy to U.S. foreign policy and to rejoin treaties, rejoin alliances that the previous administration had abandoned, and restore the country's standing in the world, rejoining Paris Climate Accords, rejoining the World Health Organization, trying to return some stability to the way things were done, bringing in a lot of old experts and professionals. In Afghanistan, he did implement the U.S. withdrawal, which had begun by Trump in Ukraine. His response was, I think, quick. He led the international effort to arm up the country as best he could, given constraints in Congress, and he rallied NATO and other allies to the cause. Regarding China, he wanted to institute a policy of strategic competition, at the same time building up alliances in the region with Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. Which brings us to the current administration. Dan and I can pull out what remains of our hair talking about it. It is the few guardrails and the few individuals in the first Trump administration who were able to moderate somewhat the unprofessional and, I believe, un-American policies that he put forth. They're gone, and we don't really have a functioning Department of State. We don't. our current. How many jobs does Marco Rubio have now, Dan? He's the head of the State Department, the head of USAID. He's the head of the National Archives and something else, right?
NSC.
NSC. Oh yeah, I forgot.
Yeah,
Doesn't none of which matter.
right.
Uh,
Yeah, he must be a very talented fellow. We don't hear much from him. Well,
yeah.
enough said. As you say, Jack, we're both, you and I are many of our, I would say all of our colleagues are dispirited, discouraged, and hoping for something better at some point. Um,
Uh, we've covered a tremendous amount. I mean, 250 years in hour and 15 some odd minutes. There's a lot to it. I hope I'm sure I missed a tremendous amount. There are entire continents I didn't mention, but I think that gives you a flavor. I do think that eventually the U.S. will return to a policy similar to that we had previously, but unfortunately, um, the respect we had previously will have been diminished significantly by then.
mhm. Um, Jack, you've done an amazing thing in barely over an hour. You've given us the contents of what should be a year, of course, and we know that you're fully capable of doing that. And we want to come and sit by your side and hear the many things you didn't have time to do. We do want to acknowledge a chat from Olga Jean-Baptiste. I'm going to read it. I am a World Trade Center survivor. All of the doctors and nurses who worked in the clinic are dead. Only 3 of us are left, including myself, and we all have cancer. She has gotten
Um,
some very supportive responses in the chat. Olga, we did not know this about you. She put this up, Jack, when you were mentioning the World Trade Center bombing. And Olga, we thank you. We really wish you the best, and we're so glad that you're with us. Jack, you've done so much. The, just a couple of things come to mind. You mentioned George Bush Sr. as and his skill in basically ending the Cold War. I think it appears you and I agree. It was more Bush than it was Reagan who actually ended the Cold War. And it's where there's a whole literature on this, folks. Very fascinating. If you ever have time to look into this, the personal connections between Bush and Gorbachev and between Schultz and Shevardnadze, their foreign ministries. This all had to do with trust among individuals who were people of honor, all 4 of those. Shevardnadze later went on to do some strange things in his native Georgia, but at the time of these negotiations, it was really kind of miraculous. You also talked, Jack, about Obama not having an ideology. I don't differ with that. Just to mention, in a previous session, I mentioned Reinhold Niebuhr, the so-called realist Christian, who Obama mentioned many times as the go-to, the one that he really trusted, and I think the one who inspired Obama to be very cautious, to not do stupid stuff, as you put it. It was a rude word that he used. Um, he attributed these approaches to his reading of Reinhold Niebuhr. Also, to mention, you mentioned in the 19th and early 20th century, individuals who were not officially diplomats, but who did the equivalent of diplomacy. This makes us think of Steve Witkoff, does it not? Steve Witkoff does not have an official function, but in the current administration, with the discarding basically of advice and actions from both the State Department and the National Security Council, the current president seems to have ceded in the Middle East and to some extent in Ukraine his relations to a family friend, Steve Witkoff, a person, I will say it,
yeah,
of very limited talent.
Whit, when I was kind of surprised by one. I mean, little gestures say a lot. Witkoff was originally thrown into the Middle East negotiating process. And then somehow he started going to Moscow. And he didn't know anything about the Middle East other than real estate.
Right.
And then he walked into Putin and made a gesture that was appropriate to the Middle East,
Right.
and had and anyone
Yeah.
working in Russia would know you don't do that. Uh, uh, yeah, it is scary.
And if
The-
if we're going to gang up on him, when he went to meet Putin one-on-one, there was a woman in the room, and he said to her, "Are you an employee of the U.S. Embassy?" And she lied and said, "Yes, I am." She was, he came into that meeting with no note taker, with no interpreter, relying on that individual, I don't know her name, who was FSB. And he took her interpretations, he trusted her, believing that she was from the U.S. Embassy. Um, I do want to take Boniface has a comment. Well, if people have time, I know I do. I don't, I hope Jack has a few more minutes.
for sure.
Boniface, let's hear you. And I'm going to put some other things up on the screen while we're listening to Boniface.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you so much, Jack, for the always insightful presentation. I think this is one of the ones to revisit later with a browser, just to follow all the historical anecdotes later on. So thank you so much. Mine is a question on uh, the gunboat diplomacy. What were the outcomes of it, and how do you link that
Mhm.
to Trump's modern day trade policies? Because I had something interesting you said there, that this was relatively a new approach at that time, using trade for diplomacy, but we see that a lot more now in the in the diplomatic sphere. So maybe you can draw
Um,
parallels or like give some insight on that.
Great comment, Boniface. And this word transactional keeps coming up in describing the Trump approach. It's not irrational. It is not strategic in the traditional sense, but transactional. We think of it as being amoral and without an ideology, and yet it does at least successfully describe a pattern. So, Jack, that's a great comment from Boniface.
I,
Yeah.
no, if I could just respond, I think that if you compare, say, Commodore Perry going to Japan with his what they called the black ships, very modern very modern warships, his goal was to open up a country to American commerce. The difference in the current administration is that the individuals who are doing the negotiations are themselves personally. I mean, Commodore Perry didn't open up a business in Japan. That the exact opposite is happening now, and I'll just give you one example. In my old place where I lived for 3 years in Belgrade, uh, one of the things that happened in Belgrade less than 24, well, a few days after I left in a hurry, we blew up the Ministry of Defense there with American weapons as part of the Kosovo air war. And now the son-in-law of the president, who is involved in negotiations with that government, unaccompanied by American diplomats, professional diplomats, is in the process of developing the property of the former Minister of Defense into a luxury hotel and a shopping center and residential area. So here we combine personal and professional interest as opposed to uh, opening up, say, a country with your gunboats. It's a very very different thing, um, and there, as I said, the guardrails are gone.
Yeah. Let me add, we're approaching, as Jack mentioned, the 250th anniversary of the U.S. Here's as Jack showed you this cartoon by John Nast of the Manifest Destiny, the United States seeing itself as a vigorous and active female character. The U.S. in its mythology often sees itself as a female with courage and beauty and Rosie the Riveter, remember Jack? And this is a poster from the sesquicentennial. This would be 150 years, I guess, in Philadelphia. Again, uh, the same type of imagery that Jack showed us in that John Nast cartoon. Now, with regard to the 250th anniversary, I want to recommend to everybody an amazing publication, the Atlantic Monthly, which was created in the mid-19th century and which continues to be an excellent source of thought and reflection. In its current issue, celebrates the 249th anniversary of the United States, and it states, we're doing this at this time because we're not certain that we will succeed in getting to 250. It's not simply um, a pessimistic tract, or it's not simply a state of mourning in the uneasy state that we're in now. It's just saying, what if, what if it all ends now, and if we never make it to 250? Now, so that's an alarmist thing. But I've been reading this. This is the most amazing monthly issue of a periodical I have ever seen. It has from the greatest scholars, Fintan O'Toole and uh, Gilpin Faust, and the great historians and commentators, each one of them commenting on a different aspect of American history. And for example, I learned in this issue that we talk about the Mad King George III, and we remember in our national mythology and in the Broadway play Hamilton, he's depicted as just an insane lunatic. Actually, the truth was that George III was not crazy. He was afflicted by a blood disease known as porphyry, which takes a long time until the symptoms appear. The symptoms did appear late in his life, and indeed, he had to be restrained and he was in a terrible agony. But up until that time, he was actively monitoring the Revolutionary War in the U.S. Um, we opposed him, we defeated him, but we're now learning this man was not crazy. His empire had tripled in size in the year 1763. We call it the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the Seven-Year War, in which the British took what had previously belonged to the French in the Western Hemisphere and India, solidified their colonies in India. You can say this is bad or good, you can give it a value judgment. The fact was the King of England tripled, under his reign, tripled the size of the empire. An interesting fact, when he was very conscious of his role politically in his country, there were times when his prime minister made recommendations that he disagreed with. You know what he did? He temporarily abdicated. Isn't that remarkable? Isn't that remarkable? So I'm just saying, I am really luxuriating in the reading of the current Atlantic, which goes into the history.
Which is online for
It's
everyone to read.
online. There you go. It's probably not free online, but oh my gosh. And an article by Fintan O'Toole, um, imagining Madison and Jefferson, um, and Hamilton, all of whom predicted that one day there would be a tyrant who would declare that he lost an election through false voting records and would take over the country. This is very chilling. Now, predictions and thoughts don't determine a fate, and our fate is not sealed. But as Jack has said, and he speaks for me as well. We're very concerned about what we've got now. Jack, any comment about the No Kings demonstrations? 7 million people 2 days ago.
I think it was pretty amazing. I'll just you had a good quote. I'll quote one of my favorites. Not the nicest guy, but a great writer, H.L. Mencken,
Yes.
uh, just said back in the 1920s, when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross.
Wow. Wow. Let me put this up once again. It will look like this, right, Jack? Um, and this is a whole other topic. Every nation has a myth and a legend. What's the difference? Legends are based on truth. Myths are creations of the imagination. Every nation has a founding myth. And it's important, going back to what we've said about strategy and tactical empathy. One must understand the myth of the other country, even if the myth has no basis in truth. It's essential to understand because this is the way people see themselves. Um, H.L. Mencken, a great, funny, would you say he was a cynic, Jack?
Oh, absolutely. But
Yeah.
for the purpose of this class, I think it's critical that uh, people understand that if they're in any kind of a situation where they're working to mediate a crisis or negotiate an agreement, an a in-depth understanding of the other side is absolutely critical. And I've seen people walk into negotiations unprepared, and they don't even know what hit them. So I'll leave it at that.
Yes. Jack, we thank you for your wisdom. I don't know how you did all of this in an hour and 10 minutes. It's amazing. And it's clearly implied we lost a lot just for the limits of time. And we would love to sit down with you for a week and get the filler material because this is a rich history. It's bad, it's good, it's successful, it's unsuccessful. As I've said in this class, there are two reasons we concentrate on the United States in this course. First of all, it's this topic that we happen to know about, and we can speak with a little bit more authority. But secondly, every person in the world has an opinion of the United States, positive, negative, or mixed. And so, even as the United States seems to be losing its way in the current period, we still believe that there's a value in studying it and seeing how it got to where it is now. We're about to say goodbye. Jack, any final comment? And again, thank you, thank you, thank you. This has been marvelous.
Just thanks very much for letting me do this, and I wish you all the best.
Thanks a lot. Matthias has a question about public diplomacy. Matthias, I promise we'll get to that in a future session. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you, Jack Zetklulic. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.